episode of The Brown Perspective. This is your host, Romero, and I'm here with my co host, Eduardo.
¿Cómo estamos? ¿Cómo estamos? ¿Cómo estamos, mi gente?
Trying to stay strong through these crazy times.
Yeah, definitely has been a tough, tough couple of weeks, and certainly this week, I think everything has come to a head. So I know we have a lot to cover about what's going on right now.
Yeah, those videos showing police brutality they're something else.
Hmm.
I don't know if it's because we're so much more integrated with social media now, and so we're seeing more of it, or I don't know if it's just because the cops have gotten more violent against everyone. We want to talk a bit about that. It's insane how if you go on Twitter or whatever social media you use, there's so many of them.
There are. I know one that was impactful was the one in Buffalo, New York, of I think he was 75 years old,
Oh yeah,
and he was shoved back by the police, and he hit his head in the ground, and you can see the blood coming out. And he looked to be a white man, a white older man. So imagine if a white older person is not safe with the police, who really is safe.
yeah, exactly. And those two officers is probably the one that shoved them and the one that's right in front of them. They both of them have been. I think they're facing some type of charges already. Because first they were fired, but now they're facing. Let me see what exactly it is they're facing. Um, yeah, charged with assault. Because initially they were fired, and then I think the entire unit in protest of these two cops being charged, or initially even being fired, the entire group of the first responders that go out there and respond to riots, they all resigned from that position. They didn't
Hmm.
quit being cops, but they resigned in protest because of what had happened to these two cops. But when you see the video, there's there's no way to justify what they did. That's it's like 20 of them that are marching forward, and then there's this elderly man who's just standing there. Like, do you really have to push the guy, even if they were yelling at him to get out of the way? Come on, there's a better way to get the guy to move. It's not like he was resisting anyway. He was probably even having trouble hearing what the cops were saying.
Yeah, and it's just shows like a complete loss of human decency. And I think part of what I know we were trying to hope, I mean, so police brutality is the issue here. And I know that one of the other stories that I read this week was that there was a white woman who had an encounter with the cop who killed George Floyd. And he was very aggressive. He and his partner, she had a dog and a child in her van. They forced her to, they didn't say anything. They forced her to get out of the car, put her in the patrol car while the baby was screaming and the dog was barking, and really no explanation. And it's just kind of a pattern of this police brutality of not really not communicating what was going on, and b just complete disregard for folks. And I know part of it is really a symptom, as a symptom or a manifestation of the larger systems and of things that we have built that we think were necessary in order to protect ourselves against crime. And oftentimes that crime and those criminals are people of color, at least the original ones. But now we see how the system has just gotten out of control.
Yeah, definitely. Before I dig a little more into that, because I hadn't heard about that, just quickly, because we started talking about the all the videos of police brutality, but there are two other topics that we're gonna discuss related to that, which is the you mentioned to me a documentary that you saw on Netflix. I think you said it was called The 13th Amendment. So we're going to talk a bit
Yeah,
about that.
13th. Hmm.
And then the other topic, the third topic that we said was, what can for people that may not necessarily be able to go out there and stand in solidarity during the protests with everyone else, there's other ways that you can get involved. So we'll cover some of those things towards the end. Okay. So going back to what you just mentioned, when did that happen?
I think she mentioned that it happened um, maybe 4 years ago or so. And I think that she filed a complaint, um, and she followed up, and I think she was told that the officer had been reprimanded, but
Mm-hmm.
they didn't share any details. And I think it was once there was an article outlining some of the complaints against the officer that she realized that it had been the same person that she had that encounter with.
So she must be one of the 12 at this
12, yeah.
point. Initially, I had heard a different number, 10 or 9. Not that big of a difference, but now the latest one that I heard is 12. He had 12 prior complaints against him. Yeah, so she's one of those 12. Imagine what the other 11 are. And I think if you go out there and somebody wants to look for them, they can probably find a few of the other ones as well.
Hmm.
The thing that has stayed with me as I watch all these videos from different cities and the way that the police are reacting is that I'm not necessarily, like, on the one sense, I'm not surprised, because if you grow up in an inner city anywhere in the United States, you already know that that's a lot of the times that's how the cops treat the poor in those neighborhoods. And I think that's also one of the messages that Black Lives Matter has been trying to communicate for a long time, that says, look, these police officers, the way they treat us is out of control. There's too much police brutality. And but Black Lives Matter, they're not saying that the cops don't behave like this with other groups in impoverished areas. What they're saying is, they put that special sauce when it comes to black people or,
Hmm.
or minorities in poor areas. And for the first time, I get the sense that for the first time, it's becoming very difficult for a lot of Americans to just look the other way and
Hmm.
pretend like the cops and pretend like all of the times that they heard that the cops were using excessive force, that they were instigating, that it was really the cops, that the entire police system had to be reevaluated. Whenever a lot of people heard that, they always started digging up about the past, about the victim. Oh, well, oh, that victim has a criminal past. Oh, that victim was doing weed. Oh, that victim, blah, blah, blah. They're blaming the victim, because I think in a way it allowed people not to admit, or at least to shelter themselves from the reality of what was happening. So it was just ignorance is bliss, right? So they put up the defense mechanisms to maintain that reality. But specifically because of the way that George Floyd died, it's really hard for people to, first of all, to not see the brutality in that. And then now they're seeing all these videos on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, and they're seeing how the cops are behaving with peaceful protesters. Like,
Hmm.
there's rioters, there's looters, opportunists. That's always going to happen. But you can see how the cops, once they get into a specific situation, and that situation could involve looters or protesters, the cops stop distinguishing between peaceful and violent, and they don't care. They treat everyone the same. And you said with this elderly man that they pushed, and then you've seen them like it was the other guy that they pulled down his face mask and then pepper sprayed him, and then there's the other one. There's a guy on the floor. He's already on the floor on his knees. They may have already pepper sprayed him, and the cop just comes out of nowhere and kicks him, just for no reason, just kicks him, and the guy rolls. And then there's been so many of them shoving, and dude, it's crazy. It must be a real shock for all those people that have been sheltered for so long to see what the hell's going on, because this is new to them. This isn't new to any of us, because we have always known that this, when the lights aren't rolling, when the camera's not rolling, and when they're not being watched, we know that this is always how a lot of them behaved. And just one other point, sure, it's a specific percentage of cops that do this, right? Like, I'm not saying that it's all the cops, but the fact that these cops do that and then they get protected by everyone else, either willingly or unwillingly by their silence, because it's the silence of those that are not, that considered the bad cops, is that silence that allows the bad cops to continue. And then at the department level, to bury the reports, to move them from one department to another. Like, this guy had 12. This officer had 12 prior complaints against him. They probably took some action. Maybe they moved them from one division to another. Maybe they did a few things, but essentially they never dealt with the problem. And all of the good cops, they've sat around while this happens, because they follow this brotherhood, they follow this hierarchy. They don't want to in any way maybe think that they're undermining the foundation of whatever culture has been built in the police departments. So it's the bad cops that do all this stuff, but the good ones should not be let off the hook, because it's been under their watch that all of this stuff has happened, and they've allowed that thing to continue to be perpetuated.
Yeah, no, a good point. And I think you get at something that is key here. I think understanding that, we do ask cops to do a difficult job, right? So it is putting your life on the line and dealing with some circumstances that you don't know, right? So there are people, they're dealing with these situations, but and you also realize that there's a lot of folks from law enforcement who come from a military background. They probably served in Afghanistan, the military somewhere else, and then they come home, and then law enforcement is what they do. And to your point, there is, I think, within a team, right? So whether it's a soccer team, a football team, there's this sense of like, you take care of your own, your brothers and sisters to an extent. But talking from my experience, that you do build this special bond with people that you sweat, fight, and bleed with, and you do have this urge to protect them, but at the same time, you do, to your point, that there are people within those groups, there are leaders, there should be things within that culture that say, this is the way that we protect each other, and this other things, the police brutality or behaving in a certain way is not acceptable, and somebody needs to be able to coach that person and say, this is not acceptable, this is what is acceptable. And obviously, if there's a pattern of not listening to that, then you have to let that person go. So there's that. And I think also the militarization of the police department. And I think that, again, is the fact that a lot of these cops do come from a law enforcement background, and in some ways maybe bringing some of that military mentality into what's supposed to be community policing. But then the very real fact that, and this is some of the things that the 13th documentary gets to, that there's been a very intentional criminalization. There was a very intentional criminalization of Black bodies right after the Civil War that obviously eventually emerged to also criminalize brown bodies. And you see that now in the detention of immigrants and their and families and kids. And you also see an investment by politicians of both sides, both Republican and Democrat, who really invested in take this heart approach on crime, and that leads to not only unfair sentences or sentences that take so many black and brown fathers from their communities and then criminalizes so much of what they do, and it has all these ripple effects. So I think this moment has allowed many of us to kind of deconstruct and reflect and learn more about sort of the fundamental injustices that are driving a lot of what's happening now. And to your point, protest is important, and protest is bringing attention to what's going on. But now the difficult work of getting policies and practices change begins.
Yeah, yeah. The what you mentioned about the cops historically, uh, even back then, right? They had a specific role even back then, which was to protect the property and protect the government from the masses. And when it came to slaves, their role was even before you had an institution of policing. I think I remember reading this in a People's History of the United States. I read it some years back, about 5 years ago, but it started out as these militias or this community organized groups of enforcement, and they were the ones that would capture the runaway slaves to return them to the masters. So you can see there the origins of policing the slaves, making sure that they don't get out of line, making sure that they follow the like the specific set of rules that are applied only to slaves. And if they ran away, if they got out of hand, then these guys were there to enforce that. And then naturally,
and to your point,
yeah,
I think it's the deputizing of not only, I mean, yes, eventually there were police officers, but now deputizing of normal citizens to try to make those type of citizen arrests, which what happened to the Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, right? There were folks who,
yeah,
saw it to themselves to think that this black man was a criminal and that they needed somehow arrest them and bring him to justice.
yeah, exactly. And what we're seeing now is we may be seeing the consequences of letting this type of abuse go unrestrained and unchecked against a specific segment of the population. So there must be studies on this, but my theory is that the more you let it happen to a small group of people, it's only a matter of time before they start applying those same tactics to the general population. Mm-hmm. So whereas wealthy America, I won't necessarily say white America, but wealthy America, those that lived in the suburbs that were detached from these type of problems, like city problems, it's very similar to the situation with the good cops, right? If the good cops stood around just putting up with it, the same way if the general population has stood around putting up with it for such a long time, it's only a matter of time before it starts affecting everyone, not just a small group that has been complaining about being discriminated. And when I see these videos, that's what I see. I see, wow, they don't even care anymore if these protesters are black or white. It doesn't seem to matter. They're treating them all the same, but they're treating them all the same way that they've always treated black people and Hispanic people. In the hood, this is what that is. This is what when somebody says that they're protesting for Black Lives Matter because of the unfair treatment, this is exactly what they're talking about. Just imagine watching a full day's worth of Twitter videos and seeing how the cops behave, and just realizing that that's not an outlier for a part of the population. That's how a lot of the times they would act in the neighborhoods, because the cops would go in there with the presumption that these people in there are guilty, and the amount of like freedom or room for error from anyone within the community, they've always known that it's very, very small. Like any little thing, and that could be your ass getting beat up or getting brutalized. So they've always been way more patient with other groups. And then we know the history of cops escalating, roughing somebody up, and that escalates the situation, because when you rough somebody up, that obviously gets them upset, and then they think about all the other times that they've been roughed up, and then they think about all the other people. It's like, this was mentioned in the podcast that you sent me, how it's a shared experience, so that when you have a confrontation with one black man with a cop, and it gets out of hand because the cop escalated, or because the black person lost his cool, that's not just a single incident, and it's not even it's not even an incident that is a gradual buildup of all of the previous experiences of that one individual. It's a gradual buildup of the common experience of everyone, because that's a shared experience that this one person has with his community. When somebody in the community gets killed by a cop, when somebody gets brutalized, that is their experience as well, because they know it's very easy in that situation to empathize and to put yourself in the shoe of somebody else that just happened to, because it's so close to home. Whereas for a wealthy American that lives in the suburbs, it's really hard for them to put themselves in the position of somebody in the neighborhood, so it's harder for them to empathize.
That's true, and they also have a different way of dealing with it. And I remember one of my favorite Dave Chappelle skits is when he talks about the difference between how his white friends and him as a black man interact with the police, and I think there's also that sense that, hey, you have a privilege of your socioeconomic status, your education, and also that you're not perceived as a threat as a white or light-skinned person, so you can just simply say, I didn't know we couldn't do that, officer.
Yeah, with his friend Chip, the guy that is
Yeah.
trying to raise the police officer. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's one of my favorites. Yeah, Dave Chappelle is very insightful in his observations. That's why to me he's one of him and George Carlin. I see them. They're very similar because they make observations about society, and then they're able to process them and show to society the hypocrisy or the flaws in how we behave, but they do it in a way that's funny, but it also gets you to think. I want to come back to something that you mentioned earlier about people naturally forming a bond, a brotherhood with whatever group they're a part of. Because I think that's one of the keys to addressing police brutality and addressing and coming up with a way to fix it. Because at a fundamental level, the people that vote for these politicians, and even those that run the police departments, they have to understand that that's how people work. Like in the example that you gave with, I think you mentioned something about in sports. So in sports, if you have a professional team and you're not supposed to use steroids, but some of the players are using it because it's giving them an edge. Maybe they're getting a little bit older, so they need that. Well, if your buddy's doing it and you find out that your buddy's doing it, it's you can bet that a significant percentage of people are not gonna snitch on their buddy. They're gonna keep it to themselves. So they're gonna look out for each other, and that happens just about anywhere, wherever there's people involved. Mm-hmm. But if we're honest with ourselves that that's how we operate, then you can start putting together policies in police departments to discourage that, or to allow people to incentives for people not to do that. Because after all, these police officers, they do need to be held to a higher standard than everyone else, because the state has a monopoly on brutality, right? Look at how the police officers are dealing with the protesters. The police officer, beyond a certain type of de-escalation, the one tool that police officers have is violence, to inflict violence on other people. Nobody else has that. And so if we're going to give them that power over us, they need to be held to a slightly different standard in terms of how they're going to behave with each other. So there needs to be incentives in place so that what these so-called good cops, so that if they do expose someone that is too aggressive when he or she is policing, there needs to be protection for those guys, like a what is it called, a whistleblower protections.
Hmm.
But also there needs to be education that tells them it's natural for you to want to protect your buddy, because we all do that. But you're a cop and you shouldn't. And if you do that, you're going to be punished as well. And I think the fact that they arrested these three officers, or that they're now going to bring charges to them, the ones that were actually complicit in this crime against George Floyd, because they didn't stop this other police officer from doing what he was doing, they also should be held responsible, because that's how you
Hmm.
send the message that we're not going to tolerate you guys doing what everybody else does as well. And in a way, it's an acknowledgement that this is just human nature, but we're not going to tolerate it from police officers.
Yeah, so it's a way to start changing the culture and to make sure that people in that within that police department and the profession in general understand what's permissible and what's not. And I think I watched some of the George Floyd memorial when Reverend Al Sharpton was speaking, and I found his remarks to be pretty on point. But I think one thing that he mentioned was that this feels different, right? It feels like there's a greater sense of awareness, and I think part of that may be due by the fact that we're still in a pandemic, coming out of that shelter in place, the fact that there were sports were suspended, that people were pretty much glued to their TVs and to their devices because that's what you do when you're sheltered in place. So I think it's part of the reason why there was just more awareness and ability for people to see the video and see what was going on. But to the point of things are changing, the fact that the NFL just yesterday admitted that they're wrong in terms of judging the players who protested, Colin Kaepernick, who protested against police brutality and issuing a pretty strong statement in acknowledging, without black players, you wouldn't have the NFL. But obviously, it gets into the richness of the moment, the fact that now you have the NFL and other brands who came up with these statements, and you have Robert Goodell, the NFL commissioner, speaking very strongly um, against what's going on and saying that that the NFL is going to be one of those entities that's going to be more mindful and supportive of its black players. I think it's pretty significant, and I think part of it is also very convenient because I think they saw the writing on the wall and they saw what so many other people and so many other corporations and organizations are doing, and I think that they decided to do the right thing and stand with their black players and coaches at this particular moment in time.
Yeah, and I saw the message from Amazon yesterday that Amazon stands with the black community. Did you see that as well? If you
I
logged into
didn't
Prime
actually.
in the last few days, yeah, they have that message. And I was on LinkedIn, and some of my coworkers now work at PagerDuty, and PagerDuty also released a statement last week that they were saying that they were standing in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, and that they were even going to donate. And yeah, so you're right. There's a lot of companies that are doing it. Probably these companies, like a company like PagerDuty, has only been around for a few years, so it's hard to say whether or not it's opportunistic, right? It
Hmm.
might just be that the culture in PagerDuty is such that they recognize right away that this is something that they're not going to stand silent about. But then there's other companies that are doing it just because it's very opportunistic, and the NFL is one of them. The NFL is doing it because they saw the amount of support has reached a like a tipping point,
Yeah.
where it can no longer, like, the cat's out of the bag. They can no longer pretend, right? Pretend like it's not happening, like it's the victim's fault. And yeah, you're right. It's a confluence of events. I didn't listen to Al Sharpton's speech. Like, it actually kind of irritates me when I hear him talking. Not on a personal
Why?
basis, just the way that he talks. He has that preaching. He has like the
Well,
preacher
he's a
style.
preacher, yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
this one
so
was particularly good because he was preaching at a memorial service, so I think it was
yeah.
very much aligned.
I just have a natural aversion to anyone trying to, when it sounds like they're preaching to me. Anyway, but
Mm,
nothing to do with the message, right? I completely agree with the message. But what he was saying, that, yeah, I think the coronavirus had something to do with it. But to me, the most significant factor is that it's been a gradual buildup, because you've had, throughout the years, you've had cases like this, but they've always, the one main challenge that the movement has always had is that the black people that have been killed were, in some level or another, had already had run-ins with the criminal justice system, or they could be blamed easily. Oh, he was a
hmm
thug. Oh, he just robbed the liquor store and this is what happened. Oh, he instigated. They could always, people that wanted to find that justification, they could always find that with the previous cases. Even though the rest of the population was gradually, they knew that these things were happening, and every single day more and more people understood, there was still a big segment of the population that could claim that it wasn't happening and just keep ignoring it. But the way that George Floyd died, that struck a nerve with so many people,
hmm
because he wasn't resisting. He did have a past, but I think from over 10 years ago, where he had some run-in with the law. But he wasn't actively engaging in like an active crime where he posed a threat to the police officers. Like, trying to pay with a counterfeit $20 bill is not something that should end up where somebody, the cop, kills you. It's just whatever it is, whatever the the punishment should be for paying with a $20 bill. That's like a minor thing compared to getting killed by a cop. So he wasn't resisting. He was saying that he couldn't breathe. People were telling the cop that he couldn't breathe to let him go. And even after he had died, I don't know how much longer the guy kept the knee on his neck. It's just finally, well, I don't mean to sound like callous or anything, but this was a guy that they could not try to tarnish and dig up his past and say that he deserved it. People can no longer say that. And this is a huge shift now. So that's why you see a lot of solidarity. And these companies like the NFL, that's their fan base. So now they know that they're going to receive a lot of pressure from the fan base if they don't come around as well.
Yeah, but I think with the NFL in particular is interesting because in some ways, whether they did it for the right reasons or because they did it to the bottom line, the fact that they made that that they've taken this posture is important because I think it does now open up the opportunity for a lot of the other fans, the white fan base, to really understand, and at least I feel that it shows it tipped the balance of power towards the black and multicultural fan base within the NFL, and the NFL saying, you know what, you guys are more important just because of your humanity, and also because you, in so many ways, represent not only the present but the future for the country. But I think I want to get back to, and similar to the exercise that you did last week, and actually related to the exercise that you did last week in terms of exploring the roots of our bias against black people. I think there's getting back to the root of the criminal justice system and people in general, right? Both cops and non-cops, why they think that black people are inherently more violent and racist. And I think that's something that that we know is not true. And I think to the point that you were just making, you see somebody who was a pacifist and somebody maybe not a pacifist, but somebody who was a nice person, who was just a regular person. And I also think, and it reminds me of a lot of the stuff that goes on with immigration reform too, right? Like you need to find this perfect immigrant that would set such a role model and sort of what some of the dreamers came to represent. Like these are like outstanding people and they are facing injustices. And I think that's problematic that you expect people to live up to this almost impossible standard in order for you and others to think, oh yeah, this is a fair thing to say. But to your point, I think that it just puts into question like this was not a criminal. This was not someone who, this was a decent man who maybe was struggling, who maybe had other things going on in his life, but he did not deserve this. And so I think there's this awareness of that's just fucked up. We cannot do this any longer. We need to not only hold the system accountable, but we need to hold ourselves accountable. We need to have our our companies and our organizations accountable, our families, right? There's so many like difficult conversations that we need to have within our own families, within the Latino, addressing all the racism within the Latino culture and other cultures. So I think it leads to where we are now and like what are we each doing to contribute to take advantage of this moment to get to a better place.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, let's go over how people can help and contribute. Before I'll go to the page right now, but let me just make one last point also about the NFL. What this shows you and what it should be clear to all these people is that these organizations like the NFL, they're not the ones with the power to dictate these things. It's never been them. It's always been the people. The corporation will just do what makes sense in terms of monetary sense.
Yep.
They won't resist very long if it's hurting their bottom line. The only reason why the NFL was able to turn their back on this on the grievances of black people, the reason why they were able to alienate and essentially kick Colin Kaepernick out of the league is because people allowed them to do that. It's the people. The people are the ones with the power when they organize. The corporations don't have it, just the same way that the government is not the one with the power. Neither are the cops. That's why they're so afraid of people coming together and organizing. They're terrified if people actually organize around a common cause because they know that it's always been the people. So the more that you can keep people divided, fighting with each other, pretending like, oh, black people are just exaggerating, they're naturally more prone to violence, that's why they get killed by the cops disproportionately. As long as you have a certain percentage of the population saying that, then business as usual for the NFL, business as usual for the government, they don't have to change anything because the people are still fighting amongst themselves. But in this case, look at how the people, and it's not everyone, but it's past a certain threshold now, where now they realize, oh, okay, shit, they have the power now. The power has shifted back to the people. So now we need to do something if we want to protect our investments, if we want to protect our bottom line. And so,
and can I just make a point before we move out of the NFL? And I think it's interesting because I know earlier this week, Drew Brees, one of the things that he said was that, that one of the reasons he was against black players kneeling is because he saw it as a offense to the to patriotism, to the flag. And I think all that to say that patriotism has been used in so many instances, and particularly with the NFL as a guise for, it's you're disrespecting the flag, you're not a patriotic, and it actually there's nothing more American than protest and then speaking and having the ability to say this is messed up and get together with other people and sort of get your government and your representatives to address it. So in some ways, it's a small way to your point for the people to define what being patriotic means. It's not what the NFL defines. It's not what government defines. It's what we as member of this society, have agreed patriotism is, and the fact that that we have decided that this is wrong and we need to do something about it in order to be a better nation.
Yeah, definitely. It's a deflection. It's a way to deflect by making it about the army and about the flag and about the veterans. It's a deflection, but it's very effective with a lot of people, because if you
Hmm.
actually drill down into it, you realize that if they say that they're disrespecting the servicemen, the ones that gave up their lives for this country, you know who else is disrespecting them? The government that doesn't give them proper health care when they come back,
Or
right?
that freaking sends them to kill them, right?
Yeah,
That decides to, whether it's Vietnam,
yeah,
Afghanistan, and all
exactly.
those things, like send up to
Yeah.
fight
Well, even
unjust
even worse,
wars.
you've sent them to fight these like unjust wars to profit, like all these other like profiteering corporations, and then they come back with as amputees. They come back with PTSD, and they don't even get adequate health care. So
Hmm.
you tell me, all these people that say, oh, that they get all this like what is it, righteous indignation that you are disrespecting our servicemen. It's like, oh, you care enough that they get disrespected? Oh, tell me, what are you doing to make sure that when they come back they have proper health care? Probably nothing. Right? So anyway, let's yeah, let's go to what you mentioned earlier, which was the for a lot of people that aren't able to make it out to the protests. That doesn't mean that there are not other ways that you can help, that you can show your support, stand in solidarity with them. Obviously, the way that communicating on social media is one of them. Uh, Arguing with people, even if it is with somebody that you're trying to allow them to see another perspective. And I came across this page here that lists some ways that people can help. For example, um, so donate to bail efforts. This one's actually pretty interesting, because what you can do is there's funds that help specifically those that have been arrested protesting, so that
Hmm.
obviously it helps a lot, because a lot of these people that are protesting, they're pretty young too. You don't know how it's going to affect them financially to be arrested and to have that on their, if it does go on their record in some form. You don't know how it's going to affect them, considering especially if they have to spend time in jail. So donating to one of these causes is a good way of helping. um, be on call for friends and family. I think this is more about moral support, which is always, it's always helpful, assuming that you don't get into divisive arguments with part of your family if they lean right, if they have a different view of these protests. Let's see. So that one was on this page. The other one was six. Here, I scroll down. So how to support Black Lives Matter where you are. And by the way, you don't necessarily have to, like, this doesn't have to be just about Black Lives Matter. And a lot of people make the mistake and they get upset about the word Black Lives Matter, because then they start deflecting the same way with the NFL protests. They start deflecting and they start saying, well, what about, all of the white people that police kill, or all the other people? Yeah, police kill other people too. They just happen to kill more black people. But that doesn't mean that the police officers, that the underlying problem is not police brutality. So if you don't want to donate to Black Lives Matter, you can donate to funds that fight against police brutality, that don't focus just on black people, that just focus overall. Because if your struggle is against police brutality, you're helping everyone, right? So that indirectly, that's also helping black people. So that's one. Show up to a protest again, but if you can't, you can sign a petition. I don't know how effective signing petitions is, um, but again, maybe there's in certain areas, maybe there's ways that it can put pressure, show solidarity on social media. I had seen another one actually. I don't know if I have it here. Let me see. It might be this one. I think this one's really no. This is the same one. I think I closed it, but there was one earlier that you can write to your local elected officials, and don't send them an email, because they're not gonna, email's not as effective as actually writing to them, because if you write to them, that has to be delivered somewhere physically. And if they're inundated with letters, that sends a clear message. And if all the letters are because of your disapproval, or because the indignation that you feel based on how the police are behaving themselves, then that does have an effect. And making a phone call too, because when you make a phone call, you're using up their resources, right? So if they have staff that need to answer phone calls, then if they spend most of the day answering phone calls about this, that has an effect on them, and it could give you results. Get clued up about the anti-racist struggle, support Black creators and business owners, and then keep listening and learning. And the one that I'll add that's not on this list is that you shouldn't wait until something like this happens to be an active member of your society that is trying to tear down these walls. I mean, you should actively be doing that at every single opportunity that you get. What was it, Eduardo, that you called it a few weeks ago? You have to be anti-racist,
Yes, anti-racist.
anti-discrimination, anti-inequality. You have to stand up whenever you see that there's someone that's being taken advantage of.
Very
And
well said. I think that again, this is about our shared humanity and how we need to, we need to role model the type of society, the work that we need to do. And I know one of the things that we've noticed, and just looking at the picture that we have on the screen now, like how diverse uh, demonstrations are. And I know that the podcast that I shared with you, that was one of the observations, that I think it's not just only Black people, it's not just white people there, it's Asians, it's Latinos. So I think in many ways is the legacy of the civil rights movement and the enfranchisement. So I, as a Colombian immigrant, I know that I've benefited from the struggles and the type of services programs that were instituted to protect my civil rights, and to also protect poor people, and to help poor people get an education and live solid lives. So I think it's beautiful to see that people appreciate that, and that now a new generation is getting a chance to see their community mobilize, and see their parents, and see others come together in this way. So I think in some ways this is a silver lining of what's going on, right? Like seeing people get together like this, and kind of gives you a sense, you know what, like there are good people out there. There are decent people there who are willing to put their health, put their lives on the line for a just cause, just like so many other people before us did, which has allowed us to live the type of lives that we have lived.
oh, definitely, yeah. And there's always been good people on both sides. There's always been white people, probably even from the founding of this country, that were opposed to slavery. There's just more of them now, and that's significant. And you're right. When I see these videos, I think most of the protesters, I don't know if this is accurate, but I heard that in some places it's more white people than Black that are protesting. And it's good. It's good that we've reached that level where there's enough, that you feel that there's enough solidarity to bring about that change. I hope that this solidarity is not then taken and dismantled with some other issue in the future, like dividing people along religious lines, or what's the other one, the right to life movement about abortion, or dividing them against like transgender or gay lines. Or there's so many different ways that specific leaders, specific governments can use to divide people. And I hope that the way that people have come together here, that they stay united, and that they don't let tactics divide them when it comes to other issues, that they can see past the divisions, because it's really when they come together that they have the most power.
Very true. And I know you're one that enjoys week and month celebrations. So happy Pride Month, since we are in June, and this is our first episode of June.
Oh, there we go. We should
There you go.
next week, this is next week, assuming that half the city is not burning, and we can talk about another topic. We can get into that topic if you want as well, because there's a lot of stories that we can talk about when it comes to that, personal experiences, even within our own family, the discrimination that I've seen um, against anyone that is deemed different, right? That
Yeah.
so yeah, we won't get too much into that, but yeah, thanks for calling it out. Always making sure that we call out that these celebrations. What's next month, by the way? Is there anything next month?
Let's see, August. I don't know. I know it's September is Hispanic Heritage Month. I'm sure that there will be some additional weeks and months that are out there competing for our attention.
Uh,
So yeah, so I think the summer months are usually um more they're busy, right? People are out and about.
cool. Sounds good. All right. You wanna okay? Let's wrap it up. Thanks for the good discussion. We'll pick it up again next week.
Yes, sir. Thank you, and remember to follow us on YouTube or Instagram, Brown Perspective Now, and also you can want to send us a message or an email, brownperspective@gmail.com.
Sounds good. All right. Take it easy.
All right, you too.